Have you ever been in a situation where someone spread a lie about you and people actually believed it? Now imagine if that lie didn't just ruin your reputation, but cost you your life. Today I'm going to tell you the story of Richard Rojas, a 19-year-old whose life was brutally cut short in 2005 in Davie, Florida, after a false accusation set off a deadly chain of revenge and murder. Kristen Bellotti was born on March 20th, 1988. She was the daughter of Michael and Louise Bellotti, who also had a younger son. The family lived in a middle-class gated community called Chelsea at Ivanhoe, located in the city of Davie, Florida. From an early age, Kristen was described as a spirited child with a natural talent for music. By the age of 3, she was already singing impressively for someone so young, and many said her voice was captivating. People who knew Kristen back then believed she had all the potential to become a music star one day. The Bellotti family was known for being deeply religious. Louise, the mother, was described as a devout Christian who made sure her family regularly attended services at the local church. Kristen, her brother, and Michael often joined her, taking part in Bible studies and church events. From the outside, they seemed like a close-knit family, but behind the walls of their home there were tensions. Michael Bellotti, the father, was a successful businessman, but the nature of his business created serious conflicts with his wife. Michael owned a strip club called Secrets, located in Miami, a business that, according to rumors, had ties to the mafia. This lifestyle clashed dramatically with Louise's religious values, and over time, the differences between them only grew worse. Around 2003, when Kristen was about 15 years old, Louise discovered the true nature of Michael's business and was deeply disappointed. The arguments between them became more frequent and intense, eventually reaching a breaking point. The couple decided to divorce. Despite the separation, Michael remained involved in his children's lives, maintaining a close relationship with both Kristen and her younger brother. He was described as a devoted father who did everything he could to support Kristen's choices, especially her desire to pursue a music career. Michael paid for studio time at a renowned recording studio in Miami, the kind frequented by well-known artists, so Kristen could record a demo that might kickstart her career. But behind the image of a supportive father chasing his daughter's dreams, Michael also had a reputation for being an intimidating man. He was constantly surrounded by bodyguards, including John Pacquiana and Wayne Palazzola, and was often seen in the company of wealthy, powerful men. He resembled the kind of mobster you'd see in movies, exuding a sense of power that made many people uneasy. As a result, rumors swirled around Michael, including speculation that he had strong ties to the Florida Mafia. In that same year, 15-year-old Kristen met 17-year-old Richard Rojas at a local movie theater. Richard lived in Kendall, about an hour away from Davie. He was described as charismatic and well-mannered. Richard practiced wrestling and boxing and had an easy time making friends. Not long after they met, Kristen and Richard began dating. People close to them said they seemed like your typical teenage couple in love. Early in the relationship, Kristen decided to introduce Richard to her parents. The Bellotti family welcomed him with open arms and were immediately impressed. Louise liked him so much that she allowed him to spend weekends at their home, as long as she was there to supervise. Michael also approved of the relationship, even going so far as to develop a friendship with Richard. According to reports, Michael once gave Richard a car, a major gesture of approval toward his daughter's boyfriend. Richard began attending all of the Bellotti family events, including church services. He seemed to fit right in with their routine. For nearly 2 years, Kristen and Richard's relationship had its happy moments, along with the usual ups and downs of teenage dating. Although they appeared solid on the outside, cracks began to show in 2004. Kristen, determined to build a music career, was focused on chasing success. Richard, on the other hand, was described by her as jealous and possessive. According to Kristen, he would check her phone, call unknown numbers to ask who they were, and sometimes demanded that she cut off contact with certain friends. She also claimed Richard grew frustrated with her decision to wait until marriage to be intimate, something that reportedly led to frequent arguments. Eventually, Kristen gave in, and the two began a physical relationship, but that didn't solve their problems. Kristen also claimed that Richard opposed her dream of becoming a singer and would put up roadblocks whenever she discussed signing with record labels. These allegations, however, were challenged by Richard's close friends, who described him as respectful and not possessive. They suggested that Kristen was exaggerating or even fabricating these stories to justify her own actions. Regardless of who was telling the truth, the relationship began to fall apart, and in June 2005, Kristen decided to break up with Richard, saying she wanted to focus on her music career. After the breakup, Kristen met Julio Arce, better known as Eddie, a young musician who shared her passion for music. Their first interaction happened during a Bible study at church, and they quickly began spending time together. Eddie was described as musically gifted, with dreams that aligned closely with Kristen's. To Kristen, Eddie represented a fresh start, but according to her, Richard couldn't accept the breakup. She claimed that he kept calling her non-stop and even showed up at her house uninvited, something made easier by his closeness with her family. According to Kristen, Richard used that connection with her family to stay involved in her life. However, phone records released later revealed that the contact between Kristen and Richard was mutual. There were dozens of calls between the two, including long conversations, suggesting that Kristen was also keeping the communication alive, contradicting the narrative that Richard was stalking her. Richard's friends insisted that Kristen seemed more obsessed with him than the other way around, hinting that she wasn't entirely ready to cut ties. The truth is, this relationship between Kristen and Richard would end in tragedy on July 12, 2005. That afternoon, Louise Bellotti arrived home and found Kristen and Richard arguing. Louise was furious. Richard wasn't supposed to be there without her supervision, and she threw him out. According to Kristen, a few hours later, Richard returned to the house without permission and, using force, sexually assaulted her. She claimed it was a traumatic attack and begged her mother not to tell her father, Michael, fearing how he would react. However, Kristen's younger brother overheard the conversation and told Michael everything. When Michael Bellotti learned about the accusation, he was enraged. He showed up at Louise's house with two of his strip club's security guards, John Pacchiana and Wayne Palazzola. Kristen repeated her story to her father. She also added that Richard had been acting strangely, allegedly involved with gangs and firearms, and that he had threatened to return that night to confront her. Later, Kristen claimed she found a CD placed on her bed upstairs, suggesting that Richard had broken into the house to leave it as a warning. After hearing all this from his daughter, Michael became convinced that Richard was both guilty and dangerous. He began plotting how to protect Kristen and punish the boy who, in his eyes, had crossed the line. He made calls to airlines trying to book flights to send Kristen and her brother to Staten Island, New York, where they'd be safe. Meanwhile, witnesses say he discussed with John Pacchiana and Wayne Palazzola the possibility of handling Richard. Eddie, Kristen's new boyfriend, was at the house that night and was instructed by Wayne Palazzola to call Richard and provoke him. The plan was to bait Richard into a fight and lure him to Kristen's house. Fearing Michael and his bodyguard's wrath, Eddie followed orders. He called Richard using Kristen's phone, taunting him to come over, saying he was there and ready to face him. Michael decided Kristen and her brother needed to leave the house immediately. Wayne Palazzola took them somewhere else, likely Michael's place, while John Pacchiana stayed with Louise at the house, supposedly for her protection. Around 1 a.m. on July 13th, Richard, at his home in Kendall, grabbed his mother's red BMW and drove to Kristen's house in Davie. He probably wanted to confront Eddie or clear things up with Kristen since he denied her accusations. When he arrived around 1:30 a.m., John Pacchiana met him at the door. According to Richard Corbin, another employee of Michael's who was also there was a brief exchange of hostile words, followed by a physical fight. Richard, trained in wrestling and boxing, initially managed to defend himself. Another of Michael's employees who was at the house later said Richard taunted John Pacchiana, telling him he fought like a girl. John Pacchiana flew into a rage. Realizing he couldn't handle Richard with just his fists, he pulled out a gun and shot him twice. One bullet hit Richard in the face, the other in the neck. Richard fell dead at the doorstep, blood pooling around him. Later, John claimed self-defense, but forensic experts found the second shot was fired from a greater distance than the first. That meant after the first shot, Richard had backed off and was no longer a threat, making the second shot completely unnecessary. Louise, inside the house, heard the argument and the gunshots, but said she couldn't see what happened because it was too dark. Someone, possibly a neighbor, called the police, who arrived quickly and found Richard's body. The police questioned Louise and John Pacchiana. Louise recounted the earlier argument between Kristen and Richard and the claim that he had forced himself on Kristen but said she didn't witness the shooting. John admitted to shooting Richard, insisting it was self-defense after a fierce fight. He claimed Richard was armed and dangerous, but police found no weapon at the scene. Forensic exams on Richard's body showed no signs of a prolonged fight, casting doubt on John's version. Kristen was examined at an ER, where doctors found Richard's DNA on her, but no signs of trauma or injuries suggesting forced intimacy. This made authorities suspect Kristen's accusation was false. Police theorized Kristen and Richard had consensual sex that afternoon, then she lied, likely to manipulate her family and Eddie. Phone records showed about 75 calls between Kristen and Richard that day, many from her, contradicting her claim that he was stalking her. Richard's friends unanimously defended him, describing him as respectful and denying any gang ties or violent behavior. They suggested Kristen couldn't accept the breakup, and the fight that afternoon happened because Richard was trying to end things, possibly after meeting another girl. In the following months, the investigation stalled. At first, Michael, Kristen, John Pacchiana, Wayne Palazzola, and Richard Corbin stuck to their story, insisting Richard was a threat and the shootings were self-defense. But the police grew suspicious, especially since there was no evidence Richard forced himself on Kristen or returned armed. Kristen never filed a formal complaint against Richard, raising even more red flags. In 2006, Kristen and Eddie started dating, but in 2007, Eddie ended things, claiming Kristen was addicted to drugs. Eddie said Kristen entered rehab, and fearing retaliation from Michael, he took the chance to move away to another city. By 2008, feeling safe and free from Michael's threat, Eddie went to the police and revealed crucial details about the case. He admitted to provoking Richard by phone at Wayne Palazzola's request, initially unaware the plan was to kill him. Eddie also confirmed that Michael had discussed with John Pacchiana and Wayne Palazzola the intention to handle Richard, suggesting a planned murder. Based on Eddie's testimony, in 2008, police charged 5 people: Michael Bellotti, Kristen Bellotti, John Pacchiana, Wayne Palazzola, and Richard Corbin, with first-degree murder and conspiracy. The case took years to go to trial due to its complexity and shifting testimonies. In 2011, Wayne Palazzola pled guilty to being an accomplice and got 10 years probation. Richard Corbin also struck a deal, pleading guilty as an accomplice and testifying against the others. The trial began May 4, 2015 in Broward County Court. Prosecutors argued Kristen fabricated the claim that Richard forced himself on her to manipulate her family, possibly out of jealousy or to get closer to Eddie. They said she actively cooperated in the crime, keeping contact with Richard and letting Eddie provoke him. According to prosecutors, Michael orchestrated the plan, and John Pacchiana carried out the murder. Key witnesses included Eddie, who detailed the phone provocation, and Richard Corbin, who testified the fight between Richard and John ended before the shots, undermining the self-defense claim. The defense argued Richard was indeed a threat to the Bellotti family. They claimed Richard forcibly assaulted Kristen. They also said Richard broke into the family home and made threats, including one to come back for $2,000. John Pacchiana insisted he shot in self-defense, fearing for his life. Louise's testimony was ambiguous, sometimes siding with the defense, other times with the prosecution. But she confirmed Kristen refused to call the police despite claiming Richard attacked her. Richard's family, present in court, denied all accusations. His father, Henry Rojas, and Aunt Martha Hernandez described Richard as respectful and said he was being defamed. Richard's mother, emotionally devastated, was present but rarely spoke, seeming lost in her grief. After 10 hours of deliberation, the jury delivered its verdict on May 29, 2015. Michael Bellotti and John Pacchiana were convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy, sentenced to life in prison plus 30 years for conspiracy. Kristen Bellotti was acquitted of conspiracy but found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to 30 years in prison. A juror emailed the judge asking for clemency for Kristen, saying that while she may have led Richard on, they didn't believe she wanted him dead. Henry Rojas, Richard's father, expressed satisfaction with the verdict but lamented that nothing would bring his son back. He said Richard was murdered twice, once in death and again through defamation during the trial. In 2018, Florida's 4th District Court of Appeal overturned the convictions of Michael, Kristen, and John Pacchiana due to a procedural error. The judge allowed prosecutors to remove a juror for being a Jehovah's Witness, which was deemed a violation of the right to a fair trial. The defense argued the removal was discriminatory, though it wasn't initially clear if the objection was racial or religious. In 2020, the Florida Supreme Court reversed the appeals court decision, reinstating the convictions. The court ruled the defense had not properly raised the objection during trial, and the jurors' removal did not warrant new trials. There's no public information after 2020 about new trials or the defendants' current status, raising questions about whether they remain imprisoned or if Michael's financial power influenced the case. Richard Rojas's case made a big impact in Florida at the time. It raised serious questions about how a false accusation can destroy a person's life. Richard's family continues to keep his memory alive and fights to see justice served.